Hi, good night. Good night on my end, but good morning and good afternoon to those who are watching, wherever you are. And to you, Dr. Eisler, thank you so much for agreeing to this conversation. Anya and I are really excited about the opportunity to have this discussion with you today.
It's a great pleasure for me to be with you, and I'm fascinated by what you're doing.
What we're trying to do and facing a lot of challenge, but also a lot of opportunity and a lot of positive when we see the response to some of what we're trying to do, but because I think a lot of people haven't done it, no one has really done it before, we are making our way, as it were, talking to experts like yourself and learning from what we discuss with you and seeing what applies and what could be implemented. But so how have you been in the last year, Dr. Eisler?
Well,
2020, how is this year fared for you?
my husband and I have been in complete isolation, and really between Zoom and the telephone and the internet, it really has not been that difficult from a professional standpoint because we have been in touch virtually, and I've done a lot of interviews. So thank goodness we've stayed healthy, to answer your question.
And and how and any positive impacts of the 2020? One of the things we experienced in 2020, and I personally experienced, is that I felt that anything that was unsustainable, had to go. And
Yes.
we were forced to confront the ways in which we were living, maybe unintentionally and not understanding the impact of it on not only the environment, but on ourselves and our bodies. And your work has been about dealing with bringing about a more sustainable society. So how would you say that, 2020 impacted in you in that way?
Well, I think that, as you say, certainly the pandemic has taken a terrible toll in lives and in mental health here in the United States, and I'm sure worldwide. But at the same time, I see it as an opportunity to really rethink just about everything. And that's what my work has been about, as you know, um, because I believe very, very strongly that what we're seeing, as you said, is that the existing systems, or at least the elements in the systems that orient to what I call the domination end of the partnership domination scale, are simply not functioning. They're not supporting us as human beings. They're not supporting the economy. They're not supporting our environment. Uh, so, but we haven't had the frame to really understand what is happening. And uh, as I see it, I think once we have this frame, and I get this feedback all the time, uh, people are more uh, empowered to make the changes we need to make, starting with what I've called four cornerstones that are very different in uh, what I call domination configuration societies or partnership configuration societies. And it's always a matter of degree, it's a scale.
Before we
Um,
jump in there, can you explain a little bit, Dr. Eisler, about your work and what you do? I mean, we've been fascinated by the fact that you're a lawyer, you're a cultural historian, and you're a social system scientist, and author and educator and all of that. But those three are pretty big fields, and you've found a way to intersect them. Maybe tell a little bit about your work, and then we can get into this domination partnership scale
okay,
that you've developed.
certainly. Well, roots. I mean, if you really want to get to the roots of the passion I have for this, and I have a great deal of passion for it, it is rooted in my own early childhood as a child refugee with my parents from Nazi Europe.
Mm.
And it was that experience, Crystal Night, um, what I witnessed then in terms of, well, our capacities for cruelty as humans and for violence, uh, for domination. But I also saw my mother, by a miracle, uh, she managed to uh, save my father, get him back from the Gestapo, and we managed to escape with just what we could carry, really. At night, to Cuba, they were able to purchase an entry permit to Cuba, and I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana because the Nazis confiscated, that's official name for armed robbery, everything my parents had. And so these were obviously traumatic experiences, but uh, they led me to questions that have really animated my work, which is, given that we have enormous capacities for, and I have researched this very deeply, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
My latest book, Nurturing Our Humanity, has a lot of the evidence from biological science, from neuroscience, but we have a very deep, deep set inclination, I would say, uh, towards consciousness, caring, uh, creativity. Why has there been, because we have those capacities too, obviously, so much violence and cruelty and destructiveness? And these questions are what later, many years later, my research set out to answer. And I would say to what you have brought up that I have I think of my life as the pieces of a puzzle are coming together, the jigsaw puzzle. Not only is my research very, very multidisciplinary, but my background, as you noted, is also very multidisciplinary. Yes, I am an attorney. I got a degree in law from the UCLA School of Law. I have a background in sociology and anthropology. My first job um, was at a time when nobody was talking about it. Um, well, with a company that was an offshoot from the Rand Corporation. I was a junior social scientist there before I went back to law school. Um, really, it was called the Systems Development Corporation, and I learned about system science
Yeah.
uh, way, way back. And it has been the systems approach rather than this very siloed approach of our academy and of so much else, which fragments our consciousness completely, uh, that has animated my research. And I'll stop here
Yeah.
uh, to give you a chance to continue.
Yeah, because I'll tell you, since I as well, just in recent times, 3 years ago, came across systems thinking. It has transformed the way I approach problem solving. So, I really, fascinated by you in that regard, and how you've been applying that for the last, decades in your work. I'm curious about something in your story that you just shared. Um, you to have gone through what you went through, Dr. Eisler, as a kid, as a child refugee, and witnessed that sort of violence and domination. Um, how did that impact you personally from the perspective of trauma? And I look at your life, and I see how you've very eloquently just now said, my circumstances helped me form these questions that I then researched. Was it just an easy journey toward forming these questions? How have you managed to deal with what you've experienced as a child, and come to terms with that as an adult?
Well, uh, no, it was not an easy journey by any stretch of the imagination. It was a very difficult journey, and I want to share that because I think that uh, yes, there is pain, and domination systems or societies that orient to the domination side really cause a lot of, I mean, there's always pain, you know, there's illness, there's death, there are natural disasters, but these systems are what I consider trauma factories. And fast forward very fast now to my latest book that came out with Oxford University Press in 2019, Nurturing Our Humanity. And the subtitle says it, it's how domination and partnership shape our brains, lives, and future. What we're finding out is that even in the United States, where we don't have genital mutilation of little girls, or child brides, or child labor, or you know, a lot of, I mean, there are really a lot of trauma built into the cultures. The amount of child trauma and the resulting health, physical and mental health consequences are horrendous. One of the studies is the so-called ACEs study, so-called Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and it's in Nurturing Our Humanity. So I think that this is why one of the cornerstones I mentioned is childhood. But may I just go back to systems, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of people to this day think of systems and still either marginalize or ignore the majority of humanity, women and children. And certainly our education. Well, the historian of science, David Noble, wrote a book called A World Without Women. And he pointed out that Western science came out of a clerical, celibate, all male, misogynist culture in, you know, about 600-700 years ago. He called the book A World Without Women. I would say it was also a world without children. So it wasn't really until about 50 years ago that we even had women's studies, and then men's studies, and gender studies, and queer studies. And as for what we know from neuroscience about how our brains literally develop in interaction with our environments, as mediated by families, of course, very heavily, but also by education, religion, politics, economics. That's in some course tucked away, you know, in a psychology course or a neuroscience course. It should be part of sociology. It should be part of political science, of law, of everything. So when I speak of systems, I draw from a very large database that not only includes the whole of humanity, and yes, where we all live are not only politics and economics, you know, which is what progressives have been focusing on dismantling the domination system in, but, you know, the base of the pyramid, families. And I also pay a lot of attention to story, to language, and of course, economics, because if I wrote a whole book on economics, The Real Wealth of Nations in English just got translated into German as under a different title, which I love, The Ignored Fundamentals of Economics is the German title. And it's updated and somewhat condensed. But if we don't really pay attention to that whole picture, we are not going to, we will move forward, but there will always be enormous resistance and, yes, periodic regressions to the domination side, like we're seeing worldwide today.
So I don't know if to press you. Anya, do you think I should press Dr. Eisler on the issue of trauma and how you overcame or integrated or learned from or developed through it?
I don't think I've ever overcome it. Okay. I don't think the body remembers.
Hmm.
It's in your body.
That's right.
And that's something that we're finally learning today, aren't we?
Mhm.
Um, but I certainly have learned from it and yes, integrated it. And my work is not only deconstruction of a system, an underlying system that you can find it in all the social categories, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. I mean, think of it, whether it was Hitler, a rightist Western regime, or Stalin, a leftist Western regime, whether it's Khomeini in Iran or the Taliban or ISIS or the so-called rightist fundamentalist alliance in the United States. Uh, we're talking of contemporary societies that have been regressions to the domination side. Now, the good news, as you know from reading my work, but also because a lot of other people are beginning to write about it, is twofold. One, uh, by the grace of evolution, our brains are more primed, really. The pleasure centers of our brains, as I cite in Nurturing Our Humanity, light up more when we care and share than
Mm.
when we win and dominate. But
Mm.
also, we now have evidence that is overwhelming, really, and still pretty much ignored in the academy, unfortunately, that for millennia, we humans lived not just the last 5, 10,000 years of domination history, but for millions of years, our cultural direction was more in a partnership direction, which means a more egalitarian, including, yes, very much, gender equity, and with it, not these rigid gender stereotypes, and then the elevation of quote masculinity over femininity, less violence because it doesn't have to be built in to maintain rigid rankings of man over man over woman, race over race, religion over religion, and so on, and very different stories.
So,
And
so what,
that
sorry.
is what my work is about.
Yeah. And so why would you say in most recent times, we've, gone toward this more dominator type systems? Why would you say we've done that?
Well, there are several theories. It happened during our prehistory, that's very clear. The foraging societies, and my co-author, I invited anthropologist Douglas Fry to be my co-author for Nurturing Our Humanity. Among other things, I had been working on the book for 7 years when I invited him, but he is probably one of the world's leading experts on how we all lived for for these millennia, foraging societies. Okay,
Mm.
uh, but in my books, The Chalice and the Blade, Sacred Pleasure, uh, I go into detail really on early farming societies and even some bronze uh, societies like Minoan Crete that still oriented more to the partnership side. Uh, so this a lot of what's happening today is really not new. Okay, we're sort of trying to reinvent and recreate a different configuration. But the theories about why it happened, some theories are with greater complexity, some are agriculture, and then there is one that I think is now beginning to gain much more credence because of DNA studies, and it was introduced by the archaeologist, excuse me, Maria Gimbutas, um, that it was brought in from the more arid and inhospitable parts of our planet. We're herding rather than farming. When we split
Yeah.
from foraging
Mhm.
uh, was the norm, and that these Indo-European invaders, at least in Europe,
Mhm.
and certainly in India, it seems, brought with them this authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, very violent system. And in The Chalice and the Blade, and I'll stop with that, and as well as in Sacred Pleasure, I detail some of the remissing that took place, the changing of the stories, and of the language too.
Mm. I'm actually now having lots of questions. You previously mentioned that when you started working, you were more or less focusing on the social science. And the social science is sometimes connected to the game theory, being a mathematical model, but in game theory, we apply different thought experiments. And I'm just wondering how much of the work that you have written in your book is correlating to the notion of us just having scarce resources on the planet that we kind of have to manage somehow. And then since you're now, at least this seems to me, having a very positive attitude towards what awaits us in the future, are we really going to succeed, or is it just going to be yet another cycle? Because to me, it sounds as if we have a very heavy task in front of us, and that is, how do we form consensuses as a collective?
Well, first of all, I've been called a practical visionary. And that really means that I am neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I am realistic. I've even coined a term rather than utopia, which means no place, pragmatopia. Human societies are human creations. So we can recreate them, and we are recreating as you and I speak. But when you talk about scarcity, actually, domination systems economically create artificial scarcities. And this is documented in my book, The Real Wealth of Nations. They not only create artificial scarcity through really the misdistribution of resources, and you see that writ large right now, don't you? I mean, with the wealthy, very few. But that's not new. That's domination economics. Think of Chinese emperors. Think of Arab sheiks. Think of pashas in India. I mean, this is domination economics. Trickle down economics is just the latest iteration, so-called neoliberalism. They're wonderful at languaging, by the way. Neoliberalism for trickle down. I mean, that's a feudal concept, isn't it? Yeah. That the people on the bottom should content themselves with the
trickles. Yeah.
Scraps falling from the opulent tables of those on top. And people buy it because they are socialized to buy it. But actually also through misallocation of resources into weaponry and war, through failure to really care properly and give value to caring for children, because it's considered soft and feminine, right, in domination systems, and hence, along with women, is devalued. And overpopulation, because women, you ask women in Africa, for example, they so don't want to continue to have child after child after child. They so want to pause. They so want to use whatever family planning they can possibly have access to. These are all ways of creating artificial scarcity. We don't have to do that. That is inherent in domination systems. And not only economics, because economics don't come out of nowhere, like families, like religion, like education, they're embedded, right, in the larger system. Mm-hmm. So this is why my work has been focused on what I call whole systems change. And the frame introduced in this work of the partnership nomination configurations on each end, and the 4 cornerstones And the work we are doing at the Center for Partnership Studies, for example, new metrics that take into account the economic value, not only environmental or human, of
Right.
caring for people starting at birth and caring for nature. That's fundamental. So we are also working on tools to help people use them to accelerate the shift. So to answer your question, I think the answer to it depends on what we do starting right now.
And what should we do starting right now?
Well, first of all, I think what's already beginning to happen is a radical re-examination of actually our gendered system of valuations.
Okay.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Our gendered system of valuations. You heard me correctly, gender. Because if you really think about it in domination systems, there's always money, isn't there, for prisons, right? Well, what's that? That's the stereotype, the domination stereotype of the punitive male head of household, isn't it? For weapons and for wars.
Yeah.
Who's that? You know, it's our epic heroes. But somehow there doesn't seem to be enough money for the soft, the feminine, for caring for people, for childcare, for health
Education.
care, and yes, for keeping a clean and healthy environment. I really want to digress for a moment to talk about socialist and capitalist theory.
Right.
Because if you examine those theories, you see something absolutely stunning. They ignore the three life-sustaining economic sectors: the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy. That they relegate that to just reproductive work. And that's what economic students in most universities are still taught to this day. And GDP reflects and perpetuates that, by the way, and we can talk about that if you like. But consider for a moment that for both Smith and Marx, there was nature, for both of them, was there to be exploited, period. Nothing about caring for our natural life support systems in either theory. As for the work of caring for people in households, starting at birth, really, that was women's work. It was to be performed for free, by a woman in a male-controlled household. So much so that even when Marx wrote in the 1900s, in the 18th century, a woman in most places could not sue for injuries negligently inflicted on her. Only her husband could for loss of her services. Having been a legal background, by the way, really helped me, because laws enforce norms.
That's right.
And they can be used to enforce partnership norms. You know, we've seen that through the last 300 years. When along with the disequilibrium of the Industrial Revolution going into high gear, we've had one progressive movement after another, all challenging the same thing, a tradition of domination. And I can elaborate on that, but I don't want to give speeches here.
Oh
So
my God, we're just hanging off of every word, quite frankly. So, I mean, when you're in the flow, please go. When you're in the flow.
Well, then I will explain how it isn't me, it's having this tool of the conceptual frame of the partnership domination social scale. If you look at the last 300 years, as I said, at time of disequilibrium, when a lot of things changed through technology, right? You have one progressive social movement after another. They're not random and disconnected. They all challenge the same thing, a tradition of domination. The so-called rights of man movement of the 1700s challenged the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule their subjects. The so-called feminist movement challenged another so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over women and children in the castles, you know, a military image of their homes. The abolitionists, the civil rights, the anti-colonial, the Black Lives Matter movements today, challenging another so-called divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over, quote, inferior ones. All the movements for social and economic justice have challenged top-down rule. The movements against violence, which, as I said, is built into domination systems, it has to be institutionalized to maintain these rankings of domination. First, the anti-war movement, the peace movement, more recently, and this is a very important movement, and I've written extensively about it. I wrote the first article for the Human Rights Quarterly back in 1987 on what became known as women's rights as human rights, the movement against intimate violence, much of it in family against women and children, which is a global pandemic, and I've kept writing about it. All the way to the environmental movement, challenging our once hallowed conquest and domination of nature that at this level of technological development with our overpopulation is about to do us in unless, you know, we change this mindset. So we are, but, and this is fundamental, most of these movements, if you really look at them, they focus their energy, attention on dismantling the top of the domination pyramid, politics and economics, as conventionally defined. And they've left the foundations on which the pyramid keeps rebuilding itself, whether it's you know, Hitler in Germany, Stalin in the former Soviet Union, you know, so-called totalitarian regimes, authoritarian regimes, religious fundamentalist regimes, which are really dominator fundamentalist regimes, you know, top-down control in both the family and the state or tribe, right? The rigid subordination of women, that's not coincidental.
Right.
I mean, that's the top priority. And so-called holy wars, right? I mean, you see the domination configuration. So that's why I've paid so much attention to identifying what we have to continue to work on everything. There's no question about it. But we have to really, number one, understand that we're part of a larger movement, that the struggle for our future is not between right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist, but between these two configurations. And that whatever we're doing, we have to continue to do it, but we have to really begin to stop marginalizing or ignoring the foundations, because it's not coincidental. And I will again stop here. Well, take Nazi Germany. The normative ideal for family was what people pushing us back to domination like to call a traditional family, right? Authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family. Now, not everybody conformed to this normative ideal. I mean, studies show that, for example, people who saved Jews came from more partnership-oriented families. But it built itself because the roots were there, because especially in times of stress, as we're going through with the shift to the post-industrial era, a very quick shift, people will vote for strongman leaders because they feel more comfortable, it's familiar. And they will listen to scapegoating because they are used to in-group versus out-group mentalities, starting with the in-group of mankind and the female other, They equate difference, right, with either dominating or being dominated, with superiority or inferiority, with being served or serving. So racism, anti-Semitism, Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia, it doesn't matter. You deflect your childhood traumas. Yes, we're back to that, aren't we?
Yeah.
That was actually the question. How Marian posed it. How can we turn the triangle onto its edge? Is it that we really need to carry our hearts openly and use embody that trauma and just go with it, or do we actually have some tactics? I don't know, strategy.
Well, I think it's not either or, it's both and, isn't it? And yes, the tactics are, number one, changing the conversation. Because
Conversations for change.
That's right. And that's what you're doing.
Trying to do,
because
yeah.
if we don't really show, look, for people brought up in rigid domination cultures or subcultures, there are only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. Trump said it, it's all about domination. There is no partnership alternative. We have to show not only that there is a partnership alternative, but that it's better, that it's more economically effective, environmentally effective, and humanly effective. So if you ask, what do we need to do? We need to educate ourselves in this scale. And then wherever we are, whatever our sphere of influence is. But one thing that I would like to invite you and everyone else to do is to support our social wealth economic indicators and the social wealth index. We are now with a team of wonderful economists working on at the Center for Partnership Systems. And what do these metrics do? Unlike GDP and unlike most so-called GDP alternatives, which the GDP alternatives are important, but they only measure quality of life. They don't measure what kind of investments we'll make for a better quality of life, especially in our post-industrial era, right?
Right.
And these are the only metrics that take into account the neuroscience that show the economic value of, yes, of caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems. And the data are beginning to be there. For example, there was an Australian study recently showing that if the unpaid care work in families, in households, were included, it would constitute 50%, 50% of the Australian GDP. Why? They didn't only use market value, which of course is very depressed, poverty wages.
Yeah.
Mostly in the United States, done by women of color, very devalued and free in homes, right? But they also used opportunity cost. In other words, what would be the average wage? They use an average wage.
Right.
That a woman, and it was usually a woman still, although more and more men are challenging, quote, masculinity as defined in domination systems. So men are diapering babies, feeding babies. That's a very important partnership trend, by the way.
That's interesting. I haven't come across this social wealth index that you all are working on. I mean, I've looked, and the one that we work with is the social progress index. How does the social wealth index compare to the social progress index? I've already heard you make a couple distinctions, but maybe we could make that even more. Yeah.
Well, as I said, number one, and yes, by the way, I see a happiness index. Could this contribute? And it does, because the societies that have the most caring policies that pioneered universal health care, contemporary societies, Northern European societies like Sweden, Finland, Norway, that were so poor at the beginning of the 20th century, there were famines, today rank highest not only in the ranks of the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports. In other words, they're not socialist. They have a very healthy market economy, but they also are very high at the top almost uniformly of the global happiness reports. People are happier, and not only those on the bottom, but those on top, as is shown by studies that I cite in Nurturing Our Humanity. It's a whole new way of looking at things, but everything that seems random and disconnected then falls into place, you see.
With a systems view.
Yeah.
So in this social wealth index, how, and valuing the carers, the volunteers, the homemakers, how is that practically implemented within a society? How do you
Well, it's
propose?
already beginning to be practically implemented. Consider, look, banks are economic inventions. Slavery is an economic invention that fits domination systems, right? We have economic inventions policies now, like, for example, Sweden, Norway, Finland pioneered very generous paid parental leave. And they started by just saying, well, parental leave, and men who were socialized, you know, not to be caring, right? Because then you're a sissy, you're a wimp. And because they earned more, didn't take it. So they changed the law so that now if you have a two-parent family, if both don't take it, nobody gets it. Do you know that men are taking it? So we have to be clever in how we design these new economic inventions. Okay, but I
like
mean,
a prisoner dilemma.
yes, but see, we are so creative as a species. Look at everything we've created around you. You know, the map, the picture, the chair. I mean, we can create. This is what I have faith in. But I don't think it inevitably will happen. If I mean, to go back to your question, Anya, it will only happen if we are conscious that we have a partnership alternative, just what it looks like. And yes, that we have to really think of including the majority of humanity, women and children. And that, yes, as far as gender goes, it isn't just a, quote, women's issue. It is a central economic and social issue because of this gendered system of valuations that comes with domination systems. I mean, but once you think that way, it all makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. So at the Center for Partnership Studies, are you all doing the work of cataloging and indexing the policies that would be caring policies that would help catalyze and stimulate and grow a partnership
Well,
society?
a lot of those policies I've written about in my articles and in my books. We really are more focusing on creating new metrics, on having courses online courses that really communicate this new frame and empower people to be agents of cultural transformation, because that's what it's about. One course that we are now changing from a set time to an on-demand time is called Changing Our Story, Changing Our Lives. And this has 4 videos of me, as well as materials for study. And you can find out more about this at centerforpartnership.org. And by the way, we're in process of formally changing our name to Center for Partnership Systems, because that's what we are.
Right.
I have to ask though, are you using these metrics for any sort of reputation building, or participatory decision-making systems as well, like internal or perhaps even external?
Well, look, they can be used for participatory decision making, but the world as it is structured now, we have elected officials or appointed officials. So they are really designed to show these people that it is economically, not only environmentally and in human terms, but economically effective, much more effective to invest in caring for people. I mean, consider the post-industrial economy. What do we hear? We need the most important capital, they tell us, is high quality human capital. Well, I don't like to talk of people as capital, but all right, what we're talking about is human capacity development. And we know from neuroscience that whether we have it or don't largely hinges on the quality of care and education children receive in the first 5 years. I mean, that's neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
So if we don't invest in that, it's not coincidental that these Northern European nations have higher wages, require more training for childcare workers, and the teaching. I mean, in Finland, kids want to be teachers. It's a highly respected and valued and paid profession.
And is it connected to, sorry, the way I saw it, still see it basically, is that why these discrepancies are happening economically is because people are short-sighted. They don't see what could happen on the long term if we would all invest in the right types of things and distribute the resources that we have in a way that would economically and socially contribute to the well-being of society. And then people usually just look for the shortcuts.
Well, that's part of it. And I think that getting back to trauma, short-sightedness is, just surviving the moment, really, rather than thinking. But it's also the rules of the game. I mean, the quarterly corporate report is a disaster because it demands short-term thinking rather than long-term planning.
Yeah,
So we have to pay attention to the rules, to the metrics, to the structures. And we need to develop the tools for that. Certainly government policies, but also norms. What are our norms for masculinity and for femininity? Do we really educate women and men for these straitjackets, right? And then rank one over the other? Or do we let both women and men express their full human potentials? I mean, let's start right there on a very personal level.
We do have another question. Do we want to take it, Margaret? Still have the time?
All right, let's take one more.
All right, so coming from Marianne again, what part do you think fear plays in all of this?
Well, it plays a huge part because think about it. When children grow up in a domination environments, they're frightened. They're angry. And they really have to suppress that to a large extent. They're completely dependent. I mean, children are completely dependent in domination families on the very adults who cause them pain. I mean, think about that. And that kind of socialization, by the way, is essential for domination systems because think of the European Middle Ages, never mind, societies today. You were killed if you didn't obey. So strict obedience had to be inculcated, and it was inculcated through fear. So that free-floating fear, and it was inculcated, this is what we have to understand about the human brain. the stories, the fear, the anger, that happens in domination-oriented environments before our brains are fully formed, long before our critical faculties are formed. So if people vote for strongman rule, you know, for the guy who says, I'm going to dominate and I'm going to fix it all, right? It has really nothing to do with anything real. And so today you have, what, 70 million Americans who live in an alternate reality. I mean, that's very serious stuff. And we've got to somehow break through. But they have a very integrated, regressive agenda in which women and children, yes, the status of women and children plays a major role, doesn't it? You know that studies show that people who voted for Trump had two things in common. One, they really felt very uncomfortable and angry at so-called uppity women. Women like Hillary Clinton, who sort of, you know, broke out of the dominator stereotype of what a woman should be, but also very significantly, their attitudes about parenting were more towards obedience than towards empowerment and development. So there you have it. I mean, the evidence is there. And we now have the challenge of really getting out of our comfort zones, which is right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, and start thinking in these systems, whole systems terms. And once we do feel, of course, much more empowered, especially women, but also men. You know, I get a lot of mail from men saying, finally, there's a place for me in this system. And that's very important. So, but I could talk to you forever, but I have to jump to another meeting. But I would love to have you email me just what you are doing. First of all, I addressed a conference a couple of years ago. I did a keynote for the Bretton Woods 75 conference.
Right.
And it was sponsored by Galia Bernasi, who is very much into the whole alternative currency, as you know. Yes, so I'm very, very interested in, because technology is really values neutral. The question is, how do we program it for domination or for partnership?
Well, I hope it's going to be the second.
Well, it depends on people like you.
That is so much weight on our shoulders.
Well, we've taken it on, Anya. We've taken it on.
Yes,
you have taken it on. So I'd love to have your thoughts on how blockchain can be used for the shift from domination to partnership. And maybe that's a good, I mean, wherever you are, whatever your field is, your sphere of influence, that's where you start.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. And I'm afraid I did most of the talking, but that's what you wanted.
That's what we wanted. So thank you so much, Dr. Eisler. It has been a real pleasure on our end as well. And I don't know, at times when you were talking about things, your passion and how the beauty of your smile as you shared, you know, just warmed the soul. So I know a lot of people will really find a lot of value and inspiration from this conversation. So I'm hoping that we can have many more, and we'll be sending, yeah.
I'll be delighted to do so. Maybe once you have a chance to read Nurturing Our Humanity, or The Real Wealth of Nations, we can focus in.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Because these 4 cornerstones that we're
Yeah,
talking
which,
about.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Thank you so much,
That's
Dr.
it.
Eisler.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with both of you and keep up your work. You know, I mean, if you think about it, and Margaret Meads put it so well,
Yeah,
she said everything that we have gained, you know, from changing child labor to any semblance of human rights. You know, in the Middle Ages, you said human rights. You what?
right.
Has been due to a small, usually not popular group of women and men. So keep that in mind. Okay.
So let's
Thank
do
you.
it together, Dr. Eisler.
Absolutely. Let's do it together. Bye
Okay.
bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.